Dear friends of love for volleyball, amor por el voleibol, I'm pleased to talk today with a person who has been doing countless things for a beautiful sport from outside the court as a technical delegate, member of boards of directors, both in USA and the International Confederation, and now as a delegate for Paralympic volleyball for Tokyo 2021 Olympics in facilities for indoor beach players, etc., etc. I mean Lori Okimura, who is currently with us talking today about volleyball and in her relationship with our sports. Hello, Lori. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Very happy to talk to you. Tell me, Lori, first of all, please tell me when and where your love for volleyball starts.
Well, so I come from Hawaii in the United States, and in Hawaii, volleyball is something that you're born you're born loving and wanting to learn to play. So for me, while I was not an elite athlete, I've enjoyed playing volleyball from probably 7, 8 years old, as far as, as an organized team, but definitely, enjoyed certain parts of it way before that. So I grew up playing volleyball and understanding, about it.
Okay, and where and doing what things did you start your work as a manager or technical delegate outside the court, as I told you before? And why did you decide to follow the path of the field as a leader, delegate, manager?
Right. So my path in sports, in general as a career, came about quite by accident, to be honest.
Okay.
Back when I was in college, like I said, I was never, an elite level player, but I played volleyball up through college. And when I could not physically continue to compete because of injury and accident, there was a really lucky opportunity for me to be able to continue being associated with my program in college. I went to the University of Southern California, but more importantly, a gentleman named Tim Tessalone, who is an associate athletic director at USC at the college, but also is the director of sports media and sports information. He gave me a wonderful opportunity as an intern, to continue to learn a little bit about the business, the behind the scenes side of the sport. And I also was still very much involved in the women's program. Learned how to coach, learned how to manage a program, got to watch some really great people running the women's volleyball program, and other sports programs in the athletic department. And that gave me, I guess, my first experience, with what it was like to operate behind the scenes. Because as a fan, you show up at the arena, you come to the stadium, and things are already prepared, right? You're there just in time to see the introductions and the action. But sometimes, we forget as fans or spectators that there's a whole nother level or layer, right, of sport that happens behind the scenes. Hours before that first introduction, there are people, volunteers, staff members, administrators, even the athletes themselves, right, and their support staff, arriving at the arenas and taking all that time to prepare eventually what we see and what we enjoy for, a few hours, right, during the competition. So my entry point, I guess, professionally I was an intern, I was learning and studying and trying to finish my degree at USC. And Tim Tessalone, as I mentioned before, had an opportunity, got a phone call about this opportunity to work for the Association of Volleyball Professionals, which is now the AVP Tour, Pro Beach Volleyball. Back then, Pro Beach Volleyball, the tour had two different, there was one tour for the women and one tour, for the men. And the AVP Tour was the men's tour. They had an opening for somebody in media relations, and my boss at the time said, "Hey, you should go interview for this position," and pretty much the rest is history. I came into the AVP at a time they were just just sort of reaching a peak popularity, right? They were a brand new sport for the most part, although beach volleyball had been played for several years, over a decade. In terms of commercializing it, it was a brand new time, right? Marketing, sponsorships. The Miller Brewing Company had invested millions of dollars, and this was back in the 80s, 80s and early 90s. ABC was the first carrier of live pro beach volleyball to the masses, and then followed by NBC and then cable companies like Prime Ticket and and Fox Network, they came along and provided this opportunity for not just playing pro beach volleyball, but producing it, right, as a consumable entertainment property. And coming in the early stages, of that, that era, gave me an opportunity as a very young person. I was very young at the time, and it gave me an opportunity to learn, to participate firsthand, right? I mean, there's only so many people, right, that worked for the tour at that time, and so everybody was doing multiple jobs. There was an incredibly dedicated, very small group of people, that would do everything from build the stadiums to producing the shows to administering, the players and the competitions, and then of course watching out for the commercial interests, of pro beach volleyball, which was growing very quickly, back in that stage. I'm asked this question lately. It's been several years since I started working in sports. About 30. This will be my 31st year working in sports if I continue after the pandemic. But lately, and through the years, I've tried to give back, and I enjoy the experiences of working with other students, very much like myself when I started, in college, and have lectured in classes and taught classes. And the question I often get asked is, after all these years, right, being involved and what can I point out about my career that might be, something helpful for these younger people? And it forces me to sit down and really think about it. So I'm kind of an odd person in the sense that I've had almost every job in volleyball, like literally from making the volleyballs. I worked for Mikasa for a very long time, to promoting products that are in the volleyball community, then being on the other side, running events and producing events, not just at the pro beach volleyball level, but at the what I call the consumer level. The United States has a very vibrant club and junior volleyball industry. Really, it's an industry. And many years ago, when I called it an industry, people were laughing at me like, you got to be kidding, and other people around me who also understood that it was, it was a very big piece of the sport business, right, in the United States. Now, all these years later, volleyball tournaments, and there are some really sophisticated clubs and businesses that are running, volleyball tournaments where they take a convention center or an expo center, a convention hall, and there are literally hundreds, of courts, right, of volleyball. It's a dream, right, to be able to walk through and see nothing but volleyball as far as you can see. But that doesn't happen by itself, right? There's lots of people behind the scenes that are making these tournaments happen. And when you step back and look at the whole industry of volleyball in the United States, you realize, if you're watching carefully, that these tournaments, people that, oh, it's just a volleyball tournament, what can that do? They account for millions and millions of dollars in revenue, right? And the parents can tell you that's exactly the case, right? Not only are they paying for the experience for their kids, but when a tournament, like a volleyball tournament, comes into town, there's a lot that it brings with it. Travelers, tourists, people who stay in the hotels, people who rent cars, people who eat at the restaurants and all that. So for me, being involved in, something like these tournaments, and then being the person, I started out, as being a person who was making volleyball products and selling volleyball products, around the world. And so I've seen the sport and the industry of the sport, the business of the sport behind the scenes from almost every angle. And some people say, oh, how lucky, that's great. But it can also, as much as it is a blessing, it can also sometimes be a little bit of a curse, right? Because you see things, when you see things from two different sides, it gives you a different perspective, of what's actually the reality, right, of the situation or of the industry or whatnot. So I think coming all this way now to the point where I'm sitting here, chatting with you about volleyball, I have, changed my outlook, on the sport a lot, especially in the past, 10 years or so. I don't want to say that I'm entirely, cynical or sarcastic about it or negative, but I always, lots of people will come to me and they'll ask me questions about it, or they'll have opinions about volleyball based on maybe one or two things they heard. And it's always, tough for me to not just come right out and say, well, hold on, did you know that, it's, in addition to those two things you heard, there were 3, 4, 5 other things that you should probably know, right? So it's, it's been a really interesting, experience the last 31 years. I'm not sure what the next several years, will bring, but coming into this point, I think, especially during this pandemic, I look at where I started, in the sport. And, just the other day, I was watching a little bit of the AVP has gone back to return to sport, gone back to running an event, a single event over multiple weekends, and watching, in this pandemic time with no fans and, but then still having a really good, competition, right? You get to see some stars and all that. And thinking back where I started, when this all happened, there were 50,000 people, coming down to the beach, and live television plus cable television, and hundreds of, of athletes participating on a single weekend. And I think, okay, at some point now, we have to think about our sport differently. So coming from the very beginnings to this point, it's been a real interesting, journey. Right?
It's very true what you said, Lori. It's very, very interesting because not many people knows what all the work behind the scenes are.
Right.
I'm told the people see the field, they see the players, sometimes the referees too, but all the work behind the scenes is a world behind the curtains. So I think what you do is very interesting. I like it very much because I'm working marketing and I know, but in sport marketing, I think it's very, for me, it's fascinating. You told many things that I wanted to ask you. First of all, about beach volleyball. Here in Chile, we have a very good couple of volleyball players in beach volleyball, the Grimald cousins. And before, in many years before, there was also this little problem about the difference between amateurs and professional volleyball. We suffered this also. But in these times, I mean the 80s, we saw sometimes via ESPN, some volleyball from the United States, beach volleyball, sometimes two versus two, sometimes 4 versus 2, 4 versus 4 teams in volleyball, and all these tournaments by Jose Cuervo or what you told about the AVP. Tell me, please, your experience in beach volleyball more in detail, please.
Well, obviously my experience coming from behind the scenes, this is my personal, viewpoint. I think that beach volleyball, particularly in the United States, has taken sort of a roller coaster ride. It started off very basic and it had this high point. It dipped down to, possibly the lowest points, in the mid 2000s or in the early 2000s, and then it's starting to slowly climb back up again. But it's different. You talk to the fans, if you listen to the fans and their memories, of what beach, if you ask them, what beach volleyball meant to them or what were some of their greatest memories, you get a lot of different answers depending on what era, right, of beach volleyball existed. And when we go back and remember that, beach volleyball was one of those sports that it started before the popularity, and I think the foundation started way before it became a more commercialized sport. There are associations like the California Beach Volleyball Association, like, associations across the country that were promoting grassroots beach volleyball. And, really the level was somewhat like professional, back then, but they were promoting it decades before, there was any type of organized, commercialized, beach volleyball. And in a lot of ways, the commercialization has helped raise awareness, of the sport. But in some really like the purest, the purest fans, you will say, well, in some ways, commercialization has hurt, the sport. So I'll tell you, one story. So when I was just at the end of my time with the AVP tour, and this was in the early into mid 90s, the Manhattan Beach, I live right up the street from the Manhattan Beach Pier. And, Manhattan Beach Open, right, is, and will always be, one of the most famous and iconic events, on the pro tour, even though they no longer have, a lot of pro events in Manhattan Beach. There was a point in time where, like, the weekend of the event, I mean, you could barely get around, the town, because there were so many people coming down to, to watch, to even if they couldn't get a seat, they would be in one of the nearby bars or restaurants or stores, just to be in the
Right.
area, right, to soak up the atmosphere. And there was one year I remember that, you talk about commercialization, the people used to drag their sofas, like their furniture from their houses. I remember these guys, I watched them one time dragging this sofa down Manhattan Beach Boulevard so they could put it, the night before right at the front of center court. And then the next day they would be able to have, a front row seat. And, and I always thought that was, that was great, right? That was it. That was how beach volleyball should be watched. People just piled, into the sand and, as far as the eye could see. And then the following year, the AVP went to paid seating, or, organized seating, right?
Okay.
Grandstands and such. They always had grandstands, but usually the area right around the court was either left for those people, like the sofa draggers, or they had seats, but you could just fill in first come, first serve. And the AVP eventually started a paid seating program, and it was, it was kind of a controversial, move, and again, toward the commercialization of beach volleyball. But when you think about it, the sport was becoming kind of more mainstream. Some people use the word legitimate, but I think beach volleyball was legitimate far before, it got on TV. But really, in terms of verifying that it had reached the mainstream, it was these live broadcasts, on NBC, taking the sport all the way across the country live, right? That really drew people's attention who had not yet considered, watching beach volleyball, or some people didn't even know anything about it, and they happened to turn on their TV and like, oh, what is this? Like, oh my God, look at that beautiful, that beautiful sunset, or the ocean and the pier, and where is this from? And that paid seating was kind of a, one of the turning points. There's a lot of turning points from the standpoint of the athletes, the way the scoring was, the size of the court, the ball, and all that. But from behind the scenes, I often look at, and when I talk about the business of beach volleyball, that paid seating move, as controversial as it was sort of like a timeline moment, in maximizing opportunity, for beach volleyball. On the one hand, you had the people like the guys with the sofa, who were very upset that they couldn't just drag their seats down. And what do you mean I'm going to pay to watch, beach volleyball? Last week I was playing on this very spot, with my friends. I know you don't own this spot, So yeah, there was a lot of resistance, right?
I love this.
Right. But on the other hand, there were families that did not live close to the beach and were coming, from a distance, like bringing their kids, or, just coming with their friends, saying, oh, this is great. I can buy a seat in advance and, come at the regular time and be assured that I have a place to sit as well. Even though I don't live by the beach, I'm not going to camp out, overnight and, to get a seat. So there were, it was a balance, right? There were some things that shook the traditions, of what people had become accustomed to with beach volleyball. And then there were some things like, like legitimizing seating, paid seating, that that created a window for an audience greater than the people who lived near the beach, to be able to come and experience it in person, or watch it on TV and have it be somewhat recognizable to, like, watching basketball or watching baseball, where here's the seats, the people paid a lot of money for this ticket, and gosh, it must be a really special event if they were willing to pay, $50, $100 to watch beach volleyball. Evolutionary wise, I think another moment that you see sort of like a crossroads with volleyball was the inclusion of beach volleyball in 1996 in the Olympic
The
Games.
Olympics, exactly.
Right. And so, there had been some success, lots of success actually internationally, with the FIVB. They had a beach volleyball World Series, which is now the Beach Volleyball World Tour. And back then, I think it was Brazil, Portugal, and Japan were like the first three, promoters of the series. And there were only very few events, but these events were spectacular, right? There were, even more people than we even knew in the United States, that would come to like the Manhattan Open or the Hermosa Beach Open. There were even more people coming down to Copacabana Beach and to Espinho in Portugal and to Osaka, in Japan. And that was proof, before before the internet was accessible to everybody and before social media, it's like you could only rely on, what the media covered, or if you saw a photo, or if you had a friend who was there who sent you in the mail, a picture of what it looked like, right? You had to sort of imagine, right? But the the introduction of the international series. Now, some of these events had already been running, on their own, but to put them together and the way the FIVB packaged them into a series, at least from a marketing standpoint, was really important because it showed the rest of the world that outside of the state of California or the state of Florida or Michigan or New Jersey, where beach volleyball was really happening in the States, that there was also the same passion, right? The same involvement and potentially the same commercialization opportunities around the world, and we weren't the only people in the United States playing, beach volleyball. Of course, we knew that, but we like to think, oh, it started here, we're the only ones playing it, we're the best at it. And that was true for many years. So that move of taking the World Series, which then became the qualification tour for the Olympics, very controversial, became the way that the pathway, right, that you could, as a beach volleyball athlete, attempt to qualify, for the Olympics. The FIVB and the AVP were not in synchronization, at the time. There was very little cooperation between the two.
Sorry, this time, excuse me, Lori, and this time you still work at AVP or you were at the International Volleyball Federation?
Actually, I had left the AVP by this time.
Okay.
I had gotten a job offer, a really terrific job offer. I was still coaching indoor volleyball at the club level, and I had gotten this very fantastic job offer from Richard McCoy, who was the president of NACASA in the United States. Perfect. And that opportunity to work at NACASA, that was a worldwide, family partner, right, of the FIVB, that really gave me my introduction, right, to the FIVB on a really high level, right, and very quickly, right. So I was the only woman working in the international core, for NACASA at the time at that level. I think I was one of only a few handful of people that even had ever played volleyball. that was, it's an industrial rubber company, as most of these ball companies are. They come from, in Japan, they are subsidiaries of larger corporations, right? So the sports division, it's people that have an interest in sport, but, it took a while to grow, into what it is today, right? Molten, Mikasa, Tachikar, all the traditionally Japanese, ball companies were the same way. But for Mikasa, and to this day, I still run into people internationally or the FIVB, and that's probably where a lot of my loyalty to the FIVB comes from, is the experiences I had with Mikasa. I still run into people to this day that I remember, or they remember me, and some of them don't realize I don't work there anymore, and they'll ask me a question about the balls or where their camp ball order is, but that was, I think, the moment for me where, again, going from the tour operations side, now going to the sponsor manufacturer side, I got a different education, about volleyball, and particularly beach volleyball. Mikasa has been providing the game balls for the Olympic Games and for the FIVB since 1964, and that's a very, in the world of international sport, I mean, as a marketer, right, a relationship that long is almost unheard of these days. That type of brand loyalty is very difficult to maintain, in today's market. But Mikasa, has had this very long and deep-rooted loyal relationship, with the FIVB. And yes, of course, it does involve a lot of money, and Mikasa was investing millions of dollars in being the beach volleyball and volleyball, now snow volleyball, for the FIVB. And they also, understood, I think, back then, that companies had to make an investment in order to advance the sport. And the more advanced the sport got, the more visibility it got, being included in the Olympics, especially taking place in the United States, that this would return some benefit, right, to the company. So getting to the point of including beach volleyball in the Olympic Games, the AVP was a strong brand, a well-known brand. There were a lot of athletes who competed on the AVP tour that really, would be considered at the time, and even now, the top athletes in the world in the sport. However, the AVP itself was not a national governing body. USA Volleyball was the recognized national governing body in the United States, and there can only be one, recognized body, and the FIVB was working with all the National Olympic Committees. So in the United States was the U.S. Olympic Committee. The U.S. Olympic Committee recognized USA Volleyball as a national governing body. And so the pathway to the Olympic Games was very clear. You had to be affiliated, with the national governing body and with the international tour in order to have an opportunity to qualify for the Olympic Games. And this created, at first, a very big problem. The AVP had the best athletes, arguably the best athletes, in the world at the time, but definitely, in the United States, you could say the top, because it was the only tour, right? The top athletes were competing and had been competing for many, many years successfully on the AVP tour for the men. And then for the women, it was the WPVA, the Women's Professional Volleyball Association. So for the women, it seemed like a very, clear decision. The WPVA tour affiliated with the FIVB and USA Volleyball. Their athletes were the ones being nominated to compete to represent the United States. And so for the women's side, it was a little less controversial in terms of the pathway. On the men's side, it was a fight. It was a brutal fight. In the end, as should be, the International Federation did recognize, that the AVP players should be involved. How can you have an Olympic Games where theoretically the best players in the world should be competing and not have the best players in the world, even having an opportunity to qualify, right? To me, I saw both sides of the issue, because on the one hand, I understood, what the actual governance of it was, from the International Federation down to the Olympic Committee, down to the national governing body. On the other hand, I also understood, and it was a spectacular lesson in sport, right, in the business of sport, that when you try to commercialize a sport, especially at the Olympic level, a sport that has already been established, by any group, right? But in this case, by the AVP, right? It had already been, and long before that, like the other groups that I spoke about, like California Beach Volleyball, other groups around, like Florida Beach Volleyball. So when you try to commercialize a sport that has already, enjoyed a history, right? A verified history and has already achieved a certain level of success by another organization, bringing those two groups together is not an easy task. Right. And it's something that, is still not been perfected. There have been different relationships, of the different organizations over the years. But I think that, again, another timeline moment for beach volleyball was the inclusion in the Olympic Games. And there were a lot of people that on both sides of the organizational chart, if you will, that had a lot to do with, working very, very hard, to get that to happen. Moving on, I think from the Olympics, the success of, at least in our country, in the United States, the success of the Americans in beach volleyball. And success can mean everything from winning gold medals or any color medals to simply participating, and showing people how incredibly exciting, the sport can be. That created an opportunity in the States for a real kind of like the most successful and the most profitable, I think, that our sport will ever be, moment came through those years following the Olympics. Everybody wanted to play beach volleyball, right? Everybody wanted to be like the players who played beach volleyball. The connectivity between a lot of these players having been indoor players, before they were beach players, that connectivity sparked, and there were more kids than ever trying to play the game. Yeah, they didn't. I think they were just, enjoyed volleyball at any level. That's one of the great things about our sport. Like you played, I played at different levels, right? And you can have fun if you're, playing with your family, with however many people on each side of the net, or you can have fun if you're playing in the Olympic Games, fighting for a gold medal, right? Or playing in the World Championships, right? In front of tens of thousands of fans, fighting for a World Championship, title. And that's somewhat of the beauty of beach volleyball, that it does have that kind of appeal, because it is, it's a sport that you can really adjust how you're playing, when you're playing, why you're playing, and just have fun, right? But it can also, I think those years after the Olympics showed us you can also make a living off of, at least at that time, you could make a living off of beach volleyball. So yeah, that was a very another very important time in the timeline of the evolution, of beach volleyball.
So impressive what you were telling. You told us you work in Mikasa, you work in APP. You were owner of a company, Creative and Sports Strategies, if I'm not wrong. You also
Right.
you also work in the International Federation as a technical supervisor. You have made a lot of works and jobs in volleyball. It's impressive.
I told you I had every job. I made volleyballs. I tested volleyballs. Yeah, I always.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
You were also as a chairman of the board in USA Volleyball.
Right. So let me go back to, my time at Mikasa. I want to say that, people ask me this all the time, like what's the most like memorable, right, or your favorite experience? I loved every minute of the time that I worked at Mikasa Sports. I really admired and respected my boss, Richard McCoy, and I knew him long before I went to work there. I actually knew him from when I was, just arriving in Southern California for college. He was a great advocate of the sport, but more so, he taught me how to be an advocate for the athletes, right? The players. He always called the athletes the asset, or the crown jewel, right, of the sport were the athletes. And I learned from him, how to support the athletes, off the court. I mean, of course, you can't, when you're coming from the sponsor side, it's difficult because you have a lot of people that you want to help and a lot of people reaching out to you for help, but you have to really choose carefully, like who are you going to invest your time in? Who are you going to invest your money in? And how are you going to do that, to help them? So, getting to work at someplace like Mikasa actually, was a really good learning experience. It was almost like going back to school again, great learning experience, learning how to sell products, learning how to make them. It's funny when I hear sometimes, or I'll read on the social media, message boards, people complaining about the balls and, this ball's made like that and that ball's made like this. And I always kind of laugh because I'm like, all those balls are made in the same factory, except for, these two or three companies that have their own factories, back in the day. And it's always kind of funny to me, to listen to those conversations. In fact, I just was on I just happened to catch a post, and somebody, I think it was in the old school volleyball or old school beach volleyball post or something, and someone had found online on an auction or some kind of silent auction, they found what they thought was an authentic game ball from the 1964 Olympics, the first for indoor volleyball, right? And I thought, oh, it caught my attention because, there was a picture of what they thought the ball was. And, it just caught my eye, to somebody who used to work for the company. And I'm looking at this picture and I'm thinking, I don't recognize this brand name. That's not how volleyballs were made in 1960. That's not what they look like in 1964, like maybe before 1964. And then, I just thought it was really unusual. So I just put a little, just typed in a little comment like, well, I would definitely check the authenticity, of that ball, because, in 1964 at the Tokyo Olympics, that company was, I didn't say who was, but I said that company that's in this, that's on that ball was not the official supplier of the match balls. Like, so you don't pay for that unless you check it out. But I got a couple of like really harsh direct messages saying, well, you shouldn't talk about things you don't know. And why are you interfering? If he wants to buy a ball from the 64 Olympics, you should let him buy the ball. I'm like, well, yeah, I would love for him to buy a ball from the 1964 Olympics, but that's not it, So every once in a while, the things I learned at Mikasa, they kick into my everyday life, and I just have to giggle, I have to laugh when I see something like that. But really the opportunity at Mikasa and my transition to where I am now was really kind of, again, by accident. It wasn't something that I planned out. I didn't have this master plan, of how I was going to go through this. But I had a chance. I had this great conversation. I was at an FIVB beach event, and it was a big win for the United States for Todd Rogers and his then partner and really good friend Dax Holdren. Won an event in Rosarito Beach, Mexico, and it was the first time for them as a strictly AVP, pro beach team, was the first time that they had ventured into international volleyball. And obviously with a win, it gave them a really good feeling, a really good taste in their mouth about international beach volleyball. Like, hey, we could, we're winning on the AVP. Like, we could definitely do this. We could try to be Olympians. And at that event, I had this conversation about American beach volleyball, which at the time was kind of falling apart. The AVP tour had gone under different leadership and a couple of times, and there were some financial, situations going on. The Women's Professional Volleyball League had ceased operations. Unfortunately, they had gone under some leadership changes and were not able to continue, as a viable business. And there was an entrepreneur from the software, the tech industry in San Diego, who was also a really big supporter of beach volleyball, that had an interest in trying to, cooperate with not only the FIVB, but with USA Volleyball, trying to create a tour that would include equally, men and women, instead of having two different tours running, was interested in paying equal prize money, was interested in paying the prize money right there at the site, when the tournament was over, almost like the amateur tournaments had been doing, like, here's your money, but one of the issues that the athletes were having with the AVP at the time was not being paid, money that they were owed for prize money, and all that. And this conversation turned into, a couple of weeks of sort of debate back and forth, like what would make things better, right? What are things that some of the athletes might need? Playing with the same ball as they would play with in the Olympics, playing with the same rules. The court sizes were different, using antennas versus not using antennas, rules changes and all that. And so this gentleman's name is Charlie Jackson. And he had already had a very successful and deep supportive relationship with the U.S. Olympic Committee and with shooting and rifle, USA Rifle and shooting and crew, and rowing, and so he definitely had his heart in the right place. He invested, again, a couple $1 million in creating this tour that would be inclusive, equal footing for men and women. Eventually, after 2 seasons, about a season and a half, the AVP went through another leadership change, and then they absorbed, obviously with the name brand of AVP still being strong, no matter who was behind it, the AVP then reclaimed its spot and thankfully added women, to their offering, and it just became one tour. And what Charlie was trying to do, I think, set the wheels in motion to prove that yes, the women have a spot in the conversation. The first year he ran his tour, it was strictly women because the women's tour had folded and had closed. And then he evolved the tour into being equal footing for men and women, equal prize money, equal matches, equal television coverage. And I think those two things, having a spot for the women to play, including them in the conversation, and then also providing a vehicle to demonstrate that, beach volleyball has been equal all along. The FIVB has always paid, at least in beach volleyball, has always paid equal prize money, tried to create equal opportunities, and so did Charlie. And then moving forward, the AVP resurrected itself, and then, has again gone through a lot of different changes, leadership and everything else. But these moments, in the timeline are very important. For me, about that same time that evolution was taking place, I had some personal family issues, a very sick grandmother who had a heart attack and needed rehabilitation. My mother was caring for her by herself back in Hawaii, and it was the right time to, take some time off and go back to Hawaii and help, and so, like, again, you don't plan for these things to happen, and fortunately for me, again, having had these jobs in different places, a woman named Laura D'Agostino from a group called the Tampa Bay Volleyball Club. It was a junior volleyball club that she and her husband Randy had created for their kids, Mackenzie and Kyle. And then they had also started to run these big, events, these events I was talking about earlier in our discussion, these huge convention center events. And she called me up one day and asked me, what are you doing these days? Haven't heard from you, what are you doing these days? And she had been a great customer of mine and a great friend, and someone who, when I worked her events and sponsored her events, I would actually work, her events. And having already been an event person, tried to put myself in a position as a sponsor of utilizing our funds, in the best possible way to enhance the whole event, right, for everybody. And so I got really involved, in what they were doing as a sponsor. And then when she called me up and asked me what I was doing and did I want to, collaborate with her, that's when the idea to start my company, truly was just me at first, consulting and helping out from afar. And it was the perfect remote, everyone's working remotely right now, but it was the perfect remote job for me, because it didn't require a day-to-day presence. Florida, they moved from Florida to Georgia. It's one of the largest youth volleyball or youth sporting events, period, in North America to this day. But it was perfect because, it allowed me to be at home in Hawaii, and the job market's pretty tough, in Hawaii. But it also, allowed me to stay involved, right, in the business side, the part that I liked, right, and only this time, instead of being a sponsor, I was on the inside, as part of the organizing group. And then the second phone call that I got right around that time was from Angelo Squeo, who's now the new events director at the FIVB. And back then he was in charge of the beach volleyball tour, the world tour. And it was somebody I had known since I worked with the AVP, even before I went to work for Mikasa. And Angelo had described that there were some opportunities available for what they used to call a technical supervisor, which is basically a technical delegate. And they were seeking to find more women, find more people who actually worked in the space of events. The technical delegates have lots of different backgrounds professionally, but at that time, there were only a few who actually also were in the business of either running their own events or working with other teams that ran events. And the world tour was growing, right, at such a fast pace. And the sport was evolving so quickly in terms of the presentation side of it that they were very keen. The FIVB was very keen to find more people who had a professional background, in running events. And that's kind of where, that era of my career started, right? It was sort of intertwined, but it was all circulating around events. My business started back then as well.
Fantastic. And tell me, Lori, about your experience, most recently experience in Paralympic volleyball. You're a delegate for the United States for Olympics in Tokyo. Tell me, when did you start to get involved in Paralympic volleyball, and what your experience in your future about this?
Well, this is really exciting to me. My appreciation of adaptive sport actually came through two men in the United States. One who just recently passed away, his name was Mike Hewlett, who himself, was involved very much in coaching and playing and administrating and politicking for adaptive athletes, and in particular standing and sitting volleyball. And Kessel, who retired recently from USA Volleyball, and John and Mike were the first two people who introduced me to, at the time there was a standing volleyball, US team and a sitting US team. And from the minute I saw it, I thought, oh my gosh, like what is I thought I knew every part of volleyball, like this is amazing. The pace, the athletes who were involved, visually, it's to me, I describe sitting volleyball. Now the discipline in Paralympics is just sitting, for now.
Yes.
But I describe it often to people who ask me, I said, the athletes are inspirational, and they make it look like it's really easy. But when you sit down and you try to do it yourself, you realize like how complicated, it's very hard, right? It's very skilled, it's very, very skilled. And so for these athletes to make it look so easy, it's like, wow, okay, hold on, how does this work? And over the years, for many years, I'd simply just been a fan, just been watching and trying to see as much. There wasn't as much sitting volleyball available to watch. There aren't as many, unfortunately, there aren't as many tournaments, that take place as with indoor volleyball or even beach volleyball. There are more now, that people are trying to organize local events and regional or zonal, events.
Okay.
But there are too few opportunities to watch. And then when I got involved with USA Volleyball, I was recruited to join their board of directors back in 2012. And by the time I got on the board in 2012, I had just returned from London and the 2012 games. And it was, to me, I had a lot of questions. USA Volleyball had always, been like the national governing body. I thought, okay, well, why? I know that you have a role in managing, some of the Paralympic sport, but why aren't we as an organization, in charge of it? And there were already people who were answering that question. The USA Volleyball already had a committee together of folks that were advocating to include the Paralympic disciplines, in the sort of official, management by the national governing body. And surprisingly, today they call it the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, but that's only been a year or two, in effect. There was always this separation between the Olympians and the Paralympians, the Olympic sports and the Paralympic sports. And the two international federations are different. The IOC governing the Olympics and the International Paralympic Committee, the IPC, governing the Paralympics. But from the Paralympic side, I think there's been a lot of outreach and effort to combine efforts, and joint efforts. And there's been a lot of progress made on that front. During my time volunteering with USA Volleyball, the association elected to join with the Paralympic group or side of the sport, and became the official national governing body for sitting volleyball. Just before I left, my term was over with the board last year, and just before I left, the discipline of beach paravolley was added, to the international competitive, scope. And so the goal now is to include beach paravolley into the 2028 Los Angeles Paralympics. And the organization that governs all of adaptive, volleyball is World Paravolley. They are the equivalent in the world of the Paralympic sport. The World Paravolley Organization is the equivalent of what the FIVB is to indoor volleyball, beach volleyball, snow volleyball. They are the international federation, that governs all of sitting or adaptive volleyball disciplines. And right now, that at the Paralympic level, that includes sitting volleyball, which is indoor, and beach paravolley, which is the new 3-on-3 sand discipline, outdoor, sand discipline. Again, quite by accident, a really dear, trusted colleague and friend, his name is Barry Kusner from Australia. He became the president of World Paravolley. And when he read, he and I had worked together a couple of times over the years. Like he was the competition manager, overseeing all the competition for all the volleyball disciplines at the Sydney Olympics. We'd met a few years before that at an FIVB World Congress. And then he and I worked together again on beach volleyball when I was the delegate sent to Australia for the Adelaide Australia Open as part of the Beijing Quad, for beach volleyball. And Barry was the organizer down there. And so we'd known each other and worked together, for many years. And Barry had read an article about where I think I was quoted about USA Volleyball adding a board position for the Paralympic discipline. And an extremely well-known and really intelligent guy named Brent Rasmussen was the first board member. He still is on the board of USA Volleyball, but he was the first board member identified for that Paralympic position. And Brent is somebody very recognizable in the Paralympic world. He was a Paralympian and has continued to advocate, for athletes and is a very successful entrepreneur, right, in the United States. But the article, I guess, was well circulated, and Barry had read, and I guess I was quoted in the article. And so he immediately, emailed me and said, okay, do you want to get involved in World Paravolley? And of course, over the years, and you probably understand this too, through your career, like when you hear from people that you've actually had a good experience with, that you trust, right? That you worked with, or even that you just knew, as friends, you're more likely to want to work with them and collaborate with them, because there are enough people that we don't want to collaborate with or had a bad experience with that we meet along the way, right? I mean, that's
Exactly.
100%, that's exactly what it is. And Barry was always somebody that I had, really great respect for, but also just really enjoyed working with him. Like, I actually really just enjoyed, I enjoyed the way, as somebody so high in his position, was, was down on the ground digging sand with us, was, trying to help, in any way that he could, no matter what job that meant he had to take on, even as the head of, all the organizations that he had been helping with. And so when he called, or when he emailed me, it was, of course, what do you need me to do, right? What can I do to help you? And so thankfully, to Barry, that's how I first got involved in World Paravolley. And I was really trying to understand, I was still volunteering with USA Volleyball at the time, so my role was very limited that I could take with World Paravolley. But it was a good, again, like an educational experience. So if you're going to represent something, even as a volunteer, right? I really feel like you need to understand exactly what's going on. What are the needs? What are the wants? What are the things that they're doing well? What are areas that they could use more support? And so that has been my journey, with World Paravolley. And after stepping away from USA Volleyball, I've been able to give more time. The area of adaptive sport is one where, not just in volleyball, but in other sports, that I had become really curious about, and wanted to know a lot more about. So in addition to taking on more roles with World Paravolley, I was really lucky to get an invitation to join a group called the Angel City Sports. And in fact, right now they're having their virtual annual games, Angel City Games. But it's an organization that was founded by a man named Clayton Freck, who has a terrific son named Ezra, who is a U.S. Paralympic. He's in the process of, qualifying for his first Paralympics, which will be in Tokyo next year. He's athletics, track and field superstar, I call him. Very young. I think he's 15, maybe, not even 16, maybe. Very young. But Clayton Freck and his wife Bahar had started Angel City Sports primarily because they were looking for opportunities, not only for their own son to be able to participate, but to help other parents who had kids that were, disabled or and kind of excluded from opportunities in their neighborhoods and their communities because of their disabilities. Right. So they tell stories about, and it's funny because people that I meet in the Angel City Sports, group, that as I'm getting more involved, I'll say, well, how did you first meet, Bahar and Clayton? Oh, I was standing at the street corner and this woman got out of her car and came to talk to me and ask me, like, hey, does your son have a place to play soccer? Or does your son like baseball? Or, they would see me with my son and he's in a wheelchair. And, so these people, they have their heart in the right place. Right. And I wanted to have an experience, from the volunteer standpoint, that was a little bit more, I guess, enriching, and in an area that I had no experience in, which was adaptive sports, right? I had very little exposure. Selfishly, it was also good for me that Angel City Games, that's run by Angel City Sports, that they had added sitting volleyball. And that's actually how Clayton and I had met about 4 or 5 years ago now. The Angel City Sports had sponsored a free sitting volleyball clinic. First time they'd done sitting volleyball. And a number of U.S. indoor national team athletes had volunteered to come to the event. The sitting team was competing at the time. And so, the indoor athletes said, oh, we'll come and do the clinic. And it was fascinating to me, the fact that you had kids as young as 7 with adults in their 40s and 50s that were learning how to play and competing together on the same courts, that there was all this laughter, there was all this fun. And then after the clinic was over, that's the first time I heard Ezra Freck, their son, telling his story, about his sort of evolution through sport and finding friends and, finding other people that looked like him that he could play with safely. One of the challenges for adaptive athletes is finding, places to play, not just people to play with, but places to play that are actually safe. Are they compliant with with Disabilities Act. Do they provide help or assistance if someone's in a wheelchair who has to get into the facility and the facility only has stairs, perhaps? So there are lots of challenges that the athletes go through. And the more I learned about that, the more I began to think about what our sitting volleyball athletes have to contend with. When they go on the road, it's not as easy as just sending some beach teams, or as what the indoor teams can adjust and adapt to situations, certain situations in the venues that they play in. But for sitting volleyball athletes, they can adapt just as easily as anyone else. But some of the considerations, are there enough disabled bathrooms? Are there ramps? Where places where there are stairs? Access to the court, access to viewing areas. There's lots of things that we take for granted in, and what we consider an able-bodied world, that that we really should be thinking more outside of just people who look like they can function without assistance or without a ramp or anything else, and think, well, I could use a ramp too. I could really use some help too. And we need to be a little bit more inclusive in our thinking. So that's brought me to, so today I'm really proud to be on the board of Angel City Sports. I'm learning a lot about other adaptive sports that I didn't know anything about before. Seated javelin has become one of my favorite, thanks to a guy named Justin that I met through the games, who kind of, gave me a quick tutorial on, the mechanics of seated javelin. Meeting Justin was phenomenal, because he was not, Ezra, as I mentioned before, was an athlete born with his disability. Justin was not. He's only in his early 20s, and about, I think it would be 5 or 6 years ago now, he was the victim of a drive-by shooting.
Okay.
And so his ability in athletics really came after he had enjoyed about 20 years of an able-bodied athletic life. So the transition was even more difficult, for him. It's fascinating, but again, it's, for me, I'm a little bit selfish. I thought, okay, I'm going to get more involved because now they're doing sitting volleyball. And, with the relationship that Angel City Sports in Los Angeles has with, the Olympic and Paralympic Committee, I'm hoping that we can try to encourage more opportunity for beach paravolleyball to take place, and hopefully to be adopted into the 2028 program.
As you say, volleyball is joy, is happening, friendship, is commitment, right. all what you're saying. Lori, I want to thank you for all this conversation. What you told me, it's incredible. As I told you before, or at our beginning, I want to thank you enormously for your time, for illuminating what you do outside the court, inside the court, between the court, and all the fantastic things you have made, are doing now. For me, as I told you, also it's a very satisfying to know people like you that has so. I see you have so much passion for volleyball, and now from Paralympics and your experience managing a brand like Mikasa, or your experience in beach volleyball. I think it's fascinating, all what you have done, and your time to tell us. Thank you again. I'm so happy to meet you, and invite to keep in touch, and send you many health wishes in these times. And I don't know what more to say. I'm so happy. Thank you very much for this conversation. I'm so happy to meet you. And well, you know my fan page, Instagram and Facebook and YouTube, and you're always
yes.
to participate, to comment, to share. I sent you a big hug from Chile. All the health wishes for you, your family, and all the volleyball fans around the world.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for the invitation to come on. I admire people like yourself who understand the business of the sport, who are working very hard to share that around the world. Let's continue to do that and support each other. And and anything that I can do to help that mission, please let me know. I follow you, so I'll know. I'll know.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.